Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a genuinely fascinating source text that takes us on a pretty wild journey. We're going to trace the evolution of gender dynamics, starting all the way back with a famous 1973 tennis match, and then following the author's narrative as it scales way up into some deep, esoteric, spiritual philosophies. It's a super compelling look at how society has shifted and what this specific author believes is the ultimate solution to our modern divides. Looking at our roadmap, we're going to track the author's journey from historical sports moments right into a deep sociological critique of equality versus sameness, the friction that causes, and finally, a proposed spiritual framework. Let's get right into it. Section 1, The Battle of the Sexes. The match that literally changed everything. So our source text drops us right into September 20, 1973, inside the Houston Astrodome. Picture this, a staggering 90 million people tuning in globally to watch 29-year-old Billie Jean King face off against 55-year-old Bobby Riggs. Riggs, who is a former men's champion and a self-proclaimed male chauvinist, had been publicly boasting but the men's game was just vastly superior. After he easily defeated another top female player earlier that year, Billie Jean King stepped up and accepted his challenge. The text notes that she didn't just win in 3 straight sets, she legitimized women's professional tennis in the process. This event became a massive, undeniable cultural catalyst for gender equality globally, a phenomenon that the source points out is actually still spreading today. Now, what's really fascinating here is how the author contextualizes that 1973 victory within a much broader historical timeline. The text points out that the suffragette movement of the 1900s was a highly specific campaign. They fought for equal opportunity, the right to vote, hold office, own property, but they wanted this recognition while largely maintaining their traditional societal roles. Then 1973 acts as the spark for modern equality. But look at the present day. The source notes this growing movement for fully integrated co-ed sports teams. The author uses this timeline to show us that the movement didn't just succeed and then pack up and go home. It fundamentally evolved its end goals. And that brings us right to Section 2, From Equality to Sameness, a major shift in societal objectives. This brings us to the text's core sociological claim. The author argues that over the decades, the feminist movement gradually morphed from simply dismantling inequality into a campaign aimed at blurring the lines between natural genders entirely. Basically, the goal shifted from equality, as in giving everyone the same fundamental rights, to sameness, which attempts to eliminate social differentiation altogether. The text argues that the new objective is essentially bringing both sexes down to the exact same playing field, stripping away all barriers and distinctions. To back up this claim about the push for sameness, the author pulls in some really interesting data from a Seton Hall sports poll. Get this, 57% of avid sports fans and 40% of the general U.S. population would actually like to see more opportunities for men and women to compete directly against one another in professional sports. The source uses this data point as concrete evidence that society isn't just looking for parallel, equal leagues anymore. A significant chunk of the public is actively campaigning to remove gender barriers completely. So what happens when we do that? Let's move to Section 3 to explore what the author calls frictions and polarization, the social fallout. You know the old saying, right? The devil is in the details. Well, the author makes a critical point here. While eliminating discrimination sounds amazing in theory, socially engineering the removal of natural barriers comes with major, often hidden drawbacks. The text posits that this modern push for total sameness contains some pretty significant weak spots, and these weak spots are currently manifesting as intense, not-so-friendly battles between the sexes in our daily lives. So how exactly is this friction playing out? According to the provided text, this drive for sameness has triggered severe polarization, which is largely amplified by inflammatory social media algorithms just throwing gasoline on the fire. On one side, the author points to the rise of the manosphere, which promotes highly reactive, rigid perceptions of gender roles. And on the flip side, radicalized feminist spaces foster deep resentment. The text argues that these highly polarized online subcultures are severely diminishing the ability of young men and women to just communicate effectively offline. It's leaving individuals trapped in contentious relationships and fracturing society at large. Shifting gears, we hit section 4, the principle of polarity. This is where the source transitions from sociology straight into a spiritual perspective. To actually solve this modern polarization, the author proposes that the answer doesn't lie in pop psychology or standard religion, but in seeking a true spiritual path based on universal laws. Specifically, they focus on the law of polarity. The text defines this as the principle that absolutely all of creation, from atomic elements right up to the human spirit, reflects equally important but fundamentally different masculine and feminine, or positive and negative forces. The author argues that throughout history, we've basically ignored this to our own detriment. Whether it was ancient patriarchal societies incorrectly elevating the male seed as superior, or modern feminist attitudes reducing the male role to a mere sperm donor that can easily be replaced by in vitro fertilization. Both views, the source asserts, mistakenly focus on the physical process rather than the vital spiritual union of two equal polarities. The text leans heavily on this vivid geometric metaphor from a philosophical work called The Grail Message by Shin. The author uses this quote to explain the concept of the living cross. It argues that womanhood is just as strong as manhood on Earth. They're simply operating in a different, completely complementary way. Think of it like this. One beam is the active working, the other is the passive working. They carry equal strength, and crucially, they only achieve perfection when they work together toward a single goal, what the text refers to as the light. The source argues that failing to recognize this equal but fundamentally different nature is what makes the current battle of the sexes both incredibly sad and utterly futile. Bringing it back down to earth, we arrive at section 5, toxic tactics in relationships, and the earthly struggles we face today. Looking at the reality of modern couples, the source absolutely acknowledges that there are centuries of abuse and oppressive domination to overcome. However, the author strongly asserts that it is short-sighted and frankly naive to try and win this modern battle of the sexes by subjugating a partner through psychological warfare. The text explicitly warns against these specific tactics: guilt-tripping your partner to coerce compliance, selective withdrawal, like giving the silent treatment to punish them, or emotional framing to subtly control their decisions. The source argues that, sure, while these tactics might work temporarily, they ultimately just foster deep hypocrisy and lead to devastating backlashes in the relationship. To really highlight this disconnect, the author includes this incredibly poignant observation from an esoteric text called No Solar. It describes how earthly couples so often lose their camaraderie, their tolerance, and just the simple joy of talking to each other. When that luminous beauty of love dies out, you are left with this quote right here. The source text suggests that due to this total lack of mutual understanding, an overwhelming percentage of human couples today aren't actually true soulmates. Instead, they're more like prisoners in shackles, living out expiatory relationships. Okay, so let's look at the solution in section 6, a spiritual path forward, guided by the geometric metaphor of the home. So what's the ultimate fix, according to our source, to repair this divide? It all comes back to the metaphor of the right angle. According to the text, true harmony in the home requires both partners to actively encourage the other's fundamentally different spiritual trajectory. The vertical line represents female sentiment, that's creative inspiration and divine tenderness. The horizontal line represents male sentiment, common progress and earthly achievements. The author points out that today, diverging interests completely ruin this geometry. If the husband is only thinking of business when the wife speaks of children, or the wife is only thinking of fashion when the husband speaks of his work struggles, the right angle is broken. The text argues we absolutely must honor both lines to build a new step on the stairway of life. Now, despite all this intense friction and those toxic tactics we've been discussing, the text uncovers a really interesting piece of data. 87% of married women report being very happy with their lives, compared to 69% of single women. The author fully acknowledges the rising appeal of the single lifestyle for self-actualization, but uses this data to suggest that there is still an inherent spiritual value and profound happiness to be found when this union of polarities is actually achieved. But there's a catch. And to achieve that union, the source places a massive responsibility squarely on the shoulders of men. The author notes that because men still generally hold an advantaged societal position, they often suffer from what the text calls a gracious benefactor ambivalence, basically silently granting women's demands without truly understanding the principle of polarity. The text uses this powerful quote to argue that true societal flourishing requires men to genuinely recognize the vital, equal, yet entirely distinct importance of the feminine role. If men are just paying lip service, the source warrants that these granted rights can easily be revoked down the line, plunging society right back into a vicious cycle of oppression. Ultimately, the author concludes that the real battle of the sexes isn't happening in a courtroom, on a tennis court, or in some chaotic social media comment section. It's an internal battle. The source challenges us directly. Will we keep striving for an artificial sameness, or will we actually do the difficult internal work to truly value the indispensable need for the other gender? If this spiritual framework caught your attention, the original texts dive much, much deeper into these universal laws. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep exploring.